Welcome again. The next two short stories we are going to be doing is this one called A Chip of Glass Ruby, and the following one is called A New Try. We are going to start with A Chip of Glass Ruby, written by South African author Nadine Gordimer. So, the title of the story. It refers to the jewelry that Indian women wear in their nose, and it is traditional. Now, once again, reminder. We're doing the whole elements of the short story. So let me tell you the story about A Chip of Glass Ruby. So there's this woman called Mrs. Bamji, and she's married to Mr. Bamji. She used to be married to Mr. Pahad, but he died. Right. So now, Mrs. Bamji, very traditional Muslim woman. She wears saris, and she remembers everybody's birthdays. She cooks for her family. She is just your typical mother figure, Muslim mother figure, orthodox. However, Mrs. Bamji is also very active in her community. And Mrs. Bamji helps the people with whatever she can. She's an activist, okay? And she actually goes as far as making pamphlets, anti-apartheid pamphlets. And that is what gets Mrs. Bamji into trouble. And eventually gets Mrs. Bamji arrested, and she gets thrown into jail, and Mr. Bamji has to deal with all of this, and there we go. So that's our summary of the story, right? So she is traditional in a lot of her behavior, like I've said, but she's also not traditional in the sense that she's an activist. Now remember, we are tying the title of the story to the events of the story. So we've got Mrs. Bamji and this chip of glass ruby that she's supposed to put in her nose. It is traditional for Indian women. Mrs. Bamji says, I'm not going to put this in my nose. It's too old-fashioned even for me. That's what she says in the story. Now, clearly, there's a symbol. It means something. Now, what does it mean? That some people may think a piece of glass may in fact be valuable, like the ruby glass might be something other than glass and might be valuable. Mrs. Bamji and her chip of glass ruby, she takes that out and she says, I'm not going to put that in because that is, remember, the thing in your nose is traditional. Mrs. Bamji is, in that context, both traditional and not, because she is an activist. And she also doesn't wear that chip of glass ruby. And it could be derived from the scripture as well. So there's various ways to interpret this particular title of the story, okay? The only mention in the story that they make of the chip of glass ruby is when Mrs. Bamji doesn't put it in her nose and says, it is too old-fashioned even for me, implying she's old-fashioned, she's traditional. But the chip of glass ruby in her nose is a little bit too traditional, even for her, okay? So that, for me, that is the direct link between the glass ruby, the chip of glass ruby, and the title, and how we must interpret it. However, it could also be derived from the scripture Proverbs 31 verse 10 that speaks about a virtuous woman. And Mrs. Bamji, we know, is a virtuous woman based on her actions later on that I will tell you about. And she is in fact worth more than rubies. So now I've offered you two ways of interpreting the title already. In the story, she removes her ruby. And can you see how I've highlighted that? I've put it in bold. Because she rejects the idea of being stereotypical. I love that. Mrs. Bamji is a good mother. She's a good woman. She's a good Muslim. She's a good person. She's a good everything. But she's not stereotypical because she steps outside of her comfort zone. How does she do that? So Mrs. Bamji, now remember, let's move on to the next slide because it's going to help us understand. So it's in the 1950s. Now we know 1950s South Africa. Remember, 1948, apartheid signed into law, 1953, Bantu education. So this is in the 1950s. And what was happening at that point, there was organized resistance to apartheid oppression. And it's in a town near Joburg. So people are saying, this is not right. This can't be happening. We need equality. And so there's organized resistance. And what Mrs. Bamji does as part of this, she makes pamphlets, anti-apartheid pamphlets. But at that point in time, resisting the government, the apartheid regime, was illegal. Now remember when I said earlier, Mrs. Bamji, not your stereotypical woman. She takes out the glass ruby because she doesn't want to be stereotyped. But she's a good woman, she's a good mother, good Muslim, good everything. But don't put her into a box because she doesn't fit into a box. Then, and Mrs. Bamji resists the apartheid regime, even though it's criminal. Remember, it starts where the copy machine is delivered to the house, and she uses that to make the posters, the anti-apartheid posters. It's criminal. But Mrs. Bamji does it. Why? Because she feels that it is a responsibility to help people in need. So it might not be politically motivated, but at the end of the day, she's an activist. Even though it is, it's an altruistic thing that she does. She wants to help people. Most of the events occur in the crowded living room of the Bamji home. Why is it crowded? Because it's a small house. That is where everything happens in the Bamji house. The only other rooms are the kitchen and where they sleep. So when they're awake, everyone's in the living room. That's how it is. Plot. Now, I mentioned all of this already, so this gives you the story in detail. Duplicating machine arrives. Duplicating machine, you remember, makes copies, makes the pamphlets. And now Mr. Bamji's like, what is this? What's happening here? Mrs. Bamji's like, no, put it there on the sideboard and everything. Right, sets it up and everything now. Rising action. Mr. Bamji, he starts to show his racist attitude because he says to Mrs. Bamji, why do you not want to help the natives? Like, worry about your own stuff. And Mrs. Bamji says, I remember how when you said if these things were going to happen to your family, you would react, you would do something. And Mr. Bamji's like, I'm not even listening to you now. His racist attitudes are revealed, and Mrs. Bamji continues to make the copies of the pamphlets because she feels that's the least that she can do. Remember, stepping out of that stereotypical role, but doing it in a way that is constructive, okay? And look, when Mrs. Bamji becomes an activist, although it is, I call her an accidental activist because that is not why she does it. She doesn't say, oh, I'm going to fight apartheid. She says, oh, I'm going to help the people. So she's an accidental activist. Because remember, she gives tea to these women, the black women, and then he must call the people natives, Mr. Bamji, racist. And she meets with different prominent members of society. And all of these members of society are people who are at that point fighting the apartheid regime because they want equality. And Mrs. Bamji is part of that fight in terms of making things better for people. She's not political. She is, in my opinion, an accidental activist. She's going to do what is necessary in terms of the pamphlets. That puts her into direct conflict with the government because it's illegal. But the most important thing, the thing at the heart of Mrs. Bamji's actions is that she is going to help people however she is able to do so. Falling action. So Mrs. Bamji, the climax. Mrs. Bamji is arrested. The special branch come there early hours of the morning. Colored people, Mrs. Bamji, colored people. They come and they're like, yeah, and they look for things. And what are they looking for? They're looking for evidence of Mrs. Bamji's criminal activity. And eventually, Mrs. Bamji is arrested. Her son, Jimmy, gives her an item of clothing to wear, and she goes. And she says to Mr. Bamji, they are here for me, because she knows that her actions have now led to this. Okay? So she's arrested. Now, she's in jail, and she goes on a hunger strike. Mr. Bamji, remember now, Mrs. Bamji, arrested. Criminal charges, hunger strike, getting even thinner. You know what? What's important about that hunger strike? Right at the beginning of the story, there's this description, and I love this description of Mrs. Bamji. It says that Mrs. Bamji looked like a sari that was hanging on a hanger. So here's the hanger. And now you drape the material over the hanger. There's absolutely no shape. It's very limp and very not, strong and not very firm. So basically, Mrs. Bamji looked like the wind could blow her over. And what does she do? She takes on the government. And then she gets arrested, she goes to jail, and she goes on a hunger strike. She can't afford to go on a hunger strike. She's already so thin the wind can blow her away. She does that. Because, no man, you can't treat people this way. So Mrs. Bamji, extremely principled. And Mrs. Bamji shows us that Anybody can fight the good fight. Anybody can make a difference. You just have to make the choice. And you can do it. You can make a difference. And she shows us that. What does Mr. Bamji do in this whole thing where everybody's arrested and this is happening? Mr. Bamji is confused. Why are you doing this? You are putting us in danger. Resentment. What about me? Mrs. Bamji gets arrested. She gets put in jail. Mr. Bamji sits there, and the people bring him food, and they come find out how Mrs. Bamji, and then he goes like, it's been so hard on me. I don't know what to do. And the children. And Zainab, how could you do this? And Mr. Bamji is just a victim. The victim of I don't know what. According to him, the victim of Mrs. Bamji leaving him alone and leaving him responsible and leaving him to raise the children. It's his children as well. Mr. Bamji is just a victim. How can his wife do this? It's just so wrong. Remember, mind you, he doesn't ever distrust Mrs. Bamji, you know? Like, even though she meets with all these prominent Muslim community members, which are men, he knows she's a good woman. So he's like, he kind of, at the back of his mind, knows what Mrs. Bamji is busy with. But it's too much for him to take in. Because he cannot imagine himself stepping out of his comfort zone to the extent of putting himself and his family at risk. So he's like just the victim because Mrs. Bamji has now done this to him. She's gone and gotten herself arrested. How dare she do this to him? And then he actually receives the visitors. You know, people come and find out, like, how's Mrs. Bamji? Everything okay in jail? Have you heard anything? Then Mr. Bamji's there, like somebody's that, you know, I don't know. I'm just the victim of this. Thank you for the food. Thank you for the tea. Thank you for the... He's like somebody that's in mourning. Like this has now just happened to him. No, Mr. Bamji, just no. Mrs. Bamji's in jail. And he's just... Self-pity is a terrible thing, grade 12. Dynamite conclusion. So now she's in jail. And so Girlie is the daughter. She is Mrs. Bamji's daughter, not Mr. Bamji. You know? Remember I said about Mr. Pahad? So she's Mr. Pahad's daughter. She's pregnant, she's married, she's out of the house. So she comes to Bamji and she says to him, my mom said I must come and wish you happy birthday. And it says Mrs. Bamji sends birthday wishes to her husband. Now, throughout this, so Bamji is a walker. Let's remember that. A walker means he gets up in the morning and he sells fruit and vegetables and whatever, okay? And he has like his breakfast every morning, his tea and bread. So that tells us the fact that he has tea and bread every day and gets up at the same time every day and goes out and sells fruit and veg every day. He is a creature of habit. So when Mrs. Bamji starts doing all these weird and wonderful things, he doesn't quite know how to deal with it. And you actually are allowed to feel a little bit of sympathy for Mr. Bamji because his entire life is upended. He doesn't know what to make of all of this, okay? And so now she gets arrested and her daughter comes and says, Mom sends birthday wishes. And Bamji realizes, oh, I forgot my own birthday. But she is in jail. She remembered my birthday. Before she remembers Bamji's birthday, she also says to them, don't forget about the engagement party of another family member that they are supposed to attend. So throughout Mrs. Bamji's life, and even while she is incarcerated, her thoughts are always with others and never with herself. She doesn't put herself first, ever. She always puts others first, okay? Even to the detriment of her own sanity, her own safety, her own health. And so Girlie comes, sorry, I said baby because she's pregnant and there's something I need to tell you about that. She comes and she says, Bamji, Mom says happy birthday. And Bamji realizes, oh, you know what, that is why I love this woman. All the things that have been making him angry about Mrs. Bamji, because he wonders, like, what made me fall in love with the ugly widow with the 5 children, man? How did I get myself into this? He wonders that. If you go and read the story, you'll find it. When Girlie comes and says, Mom says happy birthday, Bamji realizes that's why I fell in love with Mrs. Bamji. Because of her selfless nature, because she thinks about everybody else first, because she places other people's needs above her own. And that tells us that Mr. Bamji is not as shallow as he appears to be. Because, remember I said, she looks like a thing on a hanger. Like the wind can blow her away, and then she goes on a hunger strike, and she talks to Muslim men, and she gives the natives tea, and Bamji's thinking, and she's not even pretty, Bamji thinks like, why did I marry the ugly widow with 5 children? So that tells us, when Bamji realizes, yeah, he forgot his birthday, but she remembered. Bamji, Mr. Bamji, is not as shallow because he fell in love with Mrs. Bamji for who she is inside, for the very things that have now been irritating him about her. He realizes, yo, I love this woman because she's fabulous, man. She loves people. She cares for people. She's a good woman. And that speaks to Bamji's depth of character. Yeah, no? There's something to say for him coming to that realization. Characters and characterization. Now remember, characters are the people. Characterization is what they do. Mr. Bamji, rounded. What does that mean? You got flat and round characters. Flat characters, one-dimensional. Round, three-dimensional. He's racist, he's egotistic and narrow-minded. Remember, initially he says about the native women, and he's like, how dare this happen to me? And narrow-minded. Why are you fighting other people's battles? Worry about your own family. He eventually realizes why he married Mrs. Bamji, and that is what makes him a rounded character. Mrs. Bamji, virtuous, unselfish, in accordance with her religion. I said that. Good mother, dresses traditionally, Orthodox Muslim, helpful and thoughtful, but, very important, accidental activist. Because her desire to be all of these things places her in direct conflict with the apartheid government at the time. Why? Because she helps make anti-apartheid pamphlets. Because she is virtuous. Because she is unselfish. Okay? Because she is thoughtful and helpful. Okay? Let's move on to the next slide. So, there are 9 Bamji children, but we only meet Girlie, Jimmy, and Ahmed, right? So, Girlie is the eldest. She's very modern. Listen to her name, Girlie. So, she's adopted a very Western modern name. She's pregnant with her first child. Now, when she comes to give Bamji the news, they say that Girlie's stomach was between her and Bamji. So here's Girlie, here's the stomach, there's Bamji. And she says, Bamji, Mama says happy birthday. And Bamji realizes, wow, that's why I love her. And they say that this pregnant stomach is like representative of new birth. And Bamji realizing, yo, my wife is amazing. Are you with me? So that stomach, that baby, that representation of new birth happens in that image where we see Girlie sitting across from Bamji. Jimmy, 15 years old. Typical adolescent, patronizes his mother. Oh, Mom, you know how 15-year-olds are. They speak down to their parents. But he is supportive of his mom. He believes what she believes. And he realizes the effect of apartheid on people's lives. Also, he's the one, there, the supportive part, who gives his mum the item of clothing, the jersey, and he asks Bamji for money to go and visit his mother in prison. As much as he is your typical 15-year-old adolescent, also wise beyond his years, and he realizes the effect of apartheid on people's lives. So he's not immature. He's just your normal 15-year-old, okay? Good boy, actually. This one, Ahmed Shaim, he's the younger brother that's victimized by the teacher. Victimized because of Mrs. Bamji's actions. So the teacher says, yeah, this is the boy whose mom is fighting for black people. And poor Ahmed has no idea, like, what's happening? It's like, my mommy? Why are you talking about my mommy? And my mommy being in jail, it's my mommy. And the teacher is completely oblivious to what he's doing. And this poor child is exposed to that type of treatment. Okay, he's victimized by an adult. Reminds you a little bit of the other short story that we've done, where the little girls are victimized by the rich, the Bernals and the Calvins. Just think about that. A lot of your stories, you will notice, they overflow in terms of what our characters are going through, the types of people that we meet, and the themes that we are exposed to. So you must read the stories and take note of those special connections. Now, what are themes? Like I've said, they are universal messages. And the messages here is that change is possible, sacrifice the human condition. Let's talk about change being possible. Who changes in this story? Mr. Bamji. Mr. Bamji goes from being, how dare you leave me alone with all the children, to, I know exactly why I love this woman. Change is possible. We go from loathing Mr. Bamji for being so self-centered to thinking, hi Bamji, I'm so proud of you for realizing that. Because change is possible. And what is so good about that theme? It makes us also feel like we can change. We can also do something that's not good and learn from it and grow from it and become better. Like Mr. Bamji. Very hopeful theme, this one. Sacrifice. Who sacrifices the most? Bamji feels initially that he does, right? He feels, oh, I'm sacrificing my whole life here. But we know that it's Mrs. Bamji. She goes to jail for what she believes in. She's separated from her husband. She's separated from her community. She is separated from her children. And she goes on a hunger strike. So I don't think there's a better example of sacrifice in this story than Mrs. Bamji. Why is this a theme? The human condition. Because we are all human beings, and because of that, we are flawed, okay? So that means that we all have things wrong with us. But the human condition is of such a nature that we try and fix. We try and be better. We try and grow. We try and assist. We try and help. Okay? And that's what being human is all about, making things better. And Mrs. Bamji, she does that. The human condition, that is something that we are all able to relate to very, very well. And Mrs. Bamji is indicative of that, right? Symbolism, figurative language. We've spoken about the ruby and the symbolic significance in terms of it being the traditional Indian thing, the fact that Mrs. Bamji is a virtuous woman and therefore worth more than precious jewels. And what we see is not all that there is to see. Okay? So remember, for me, this perfectly spells out the way Mrs. Bamji looks initially and what Mrs. Bamji eventually does. When we look at Mrs. Bamji, we don't expect that we are going to meet a heroine, but we do. Mrs. Bamji takes on the big bad government. She goes to jail because of it. She fights for what she believes in. She stands firm for what she believes in. Which means that what we see is not all that there is to see. Okay? And that is why in the drama, or in the story, characterization is important. Because in the beginning, when we see that physical description of Mrs. Bamji, we don't think that she'd be able to survive prison and a hunger strike. But guess what? She does. She's amazing in that regard. Okay? Now, before I continue with the new tribe, let's just wrap up the story of the chip of glass ruby. So Mrs. Bamji has taught us that even though this story happens during the apartheid era, it could have happened at any time. Because the point is not that Mrs. Bamji took on the government. The point is that Mrs. Bamji was who she was in the time that she needed to be that. Right? So remember, she remained staunch, devout Muslim mother, wife. She did all the right things. And Mrs. Bamji's fight was never a political one. Her intention was never political. It happened so that she took on the government, but that wasn't, you need to understand, again, the idea of the accidental activist. It happened because Mrs. Bamji was fighting for all people, for everyone to receive the same, for everyone to be treated equally. So if you're taking anything away from the story of a chip of glass ruby, it's that the accidental activist is the one who often makes the most difference in the world. Right, the next story, the new tribe. And this is a very interesting story, okay? And I'm going to tell you why. The title, with short stories, we are always going to be expected to know whether the title matches the story, whether the title is significant, whether the title is appropriate, okay? So that's what the title is about. Then we've got themes, characters and characterization. We've got our plot, we've got figurative language, and we've got symbolism, okay? And so variations of that will always be presented to you when a short story is presented to you, because that is the elements, that is what you will be expected to know in the exam, okay? And that is why these slides focus on those things, because that's where your questions come from. So, what does the new tribe refer to? It refers to people who originally come from Africa but are now living in Britain. The adopted children in this story, Julia and Chester, especially Chester, are part of this new tribe. Let me tell you the story, then you'll understand. So, one day, there's a couple, and the couple are called the Arlingtons, and Mr. Arlington is an Anglican priest, and Mrs. Arlington is at home, and they are childless. She doesn't work, okay? Now, then someone comes and drops off a bundle, and in this bundle is a baby girl, and the baby girl is called Julia. So she's been left in a bag at a bus station, and the guy that finds her, who is called, incidentally, Julian, brings her to the Arlingtons, and he says, I found this bundle, this child, what do I do? So she stays there, and immediately when she arrives there, the mother, her name's Jenny, these maternal instincts just kick in, you know, and she takes care of that child, and her husband can see the transformation, because previously she was like listless, and she was just fair, and you know, she seemed like she was almost fragile. But when this little girl comes into their lives, immediately there's a change, you know, and then those instincts kick in. Right, so they apply to adopt Julia, and everything goes well, and Julia's now theirs. Then, out of the blue one day, some social worker comes there and says, you know what, there's a child that needs a home. This little boy is 18 months old. His mother is from Nigeria. She has now married a new man and is expecting twins, and her husband does not feel that he can afford the 18-month-old, which is now not his child. And she read about your story and adopting Julia, so she wants to know if you will adopt Chester. And they do adopt Chester. Now, Chester is from Nigeria, okay? So Chester is not white, Chester is black. And Chester is living in Britain, small little community where he's the only black child. So now, the adopted children, Julia and Chester, are part of the new tribe. Remember now that African, that Nigerian idea of going to Britain and living there, being called the new tribe. Chester moving from Nigeria to Britain and living with the Arlingtons and Julia, they now form a new tribe. The new tribe explored in this story is a mixed race family. It's not just people who are originally from Africa. It is Chester, who is originally from Africa, and Julia, who was left in a Tesco bag, and the Arlingtons, who are now a mixed race family living in a multicultural society. So now Chester he's got to fight this whole thing and navigate life on 2 levels, and it's not easy. Okay, so obviously he's going to be in for some difficulty. Village community in England in modern time. So we know that villages are small places. Remember, we spoke about, in another short story, the doll's house. It's a small place. So everybody goes to the same school, and everybody knows everybody's business, is that sort of idea. Okay, and it's set in England in modern times. So now, black child, living with a white family, England, Britain, little village. Why is it important? Because the writer focuses on the difficulties that's faced by adopted children and their parents in mixed-race families in Britain. So being adopted is already difficult, or adopting a child is already difficult, because you are adopting someone else's child into your life, and you are saying, I'm going to love this child as if he or she is my own, and you make that commitment, okay? Now, what happens with Julia and Chester? Julia is left on the sidewalk at the bus station, and she's a white little girl, and she's adopted. So she fits in without too much problems. But then Chester comes, and Chester's black. And Ginny immediately falls in love with Chester, and she wants to adopt him. Like, there's no story about, oh, but he's black, or anything like that. There's immediate acceptance from Ginny. But now, how are they going to navigate the fact that Chester comes from another race and another culture? Because remember, Chester comes from Nigeria. His mother asked for the Arlingtons to adopt him. Because I'm thinking the Arlingtons were Christians, she read the story of Julia, so the chances of them saying no or denying her request were 0 to none. So she asks them, please, will you give my son a home? And they do, okay? And now they're sitting with this problem. How to navigate this? I don't know. Jenny is thinking like, what happens in Nigeria? Like, am I supposed to know that? Am I supposed to teach Chester that? Or am I supposed to raise Chester like I am raising Julia? Like, what must I do? She doesn't know, okay? So she faces those difficulties. And now she also has to make Chester feel comfortable in this community while navigating, feeling comfortable in this situation herself. Okay, Arthur, who is the dad, is an Anglican minister and the Arlingtons are Christians. I've mentioned this here because that has an impact sort of on I think, why both of those children ended up with the Arlingtons. Julian found Julia in a packet and brought her to the pastor's house. And then because they adopted Julia, Chester's mother saw the article and she said, please will you take my 18-month-old? Because of the fact that, you know, that idea of the church being a safe haven and not judging and accepting, you know, that idea sort of, and this is mentioned in the analysis of the story, which is why I've mentioned it. Right, let's move on. Plot. So Jenny Arlington and her husband, Arthur, is now the church minister, and they are childless. So it's very sad, because look, they could have chosen to say this in a different way. They have no children yet. But they don't say that. They say they are childless. So the implication of being childless is that there has been an attempt to have a child, but it's been unsuccessful. Are you with me? It's not a matter of they married and they don't have children. They are married and they are childless because they could not have children. That is the crux of being childless. So the Arlingtons adopt 2 abandoned children. First Julia, and then remember Chester. I told you the story of that. And then now Chester struggles with an identity problem and feelings of unbelonging. Why? Because Chester doesn't look like everybody else, okay? But he knows that he's different. Chester tries very hard not to upset anybody, not to make people feel uncomfortable, because he doesn't quite feel like he belongs. At one point, his mother says something to him about your people, and he thinks, but are you not my people? Because you're my mom and my dad, and Julia's my sister. Are you not my people? You know, and Jenny doesn't mean to sort of make him aware of his differences. She's trying to navigate that entire multicultural idea. And in that she says, your people. And Chester latches onto that and he goes like, are you not my people? Right. The climax happened when Chester wants to know, who are my real parents? And now Arthur's like, I have to have this conversation. Because look, Chester's about 4 years old when this happens. And Chester doesn't know the idea or the word adopted. All that Chester knows is, I am different. Because they look like that, and I look like this. And he says, so who's my real mother? And now Arthur realizes, I need to tell the child the story. So now they tell them about how they came to be adopted. Please remember, at no point did Julia think that she was adopted. Because remember, she looks like them. She's white. She's British. They got her there. Her mother is from there. Chester always knew he was different. So now the story about the adoption comes out. And Julia also finds out that she's adopted. She had no idea. She's like, you know. Then Chester now has dreams about this compound in Africa, and he doesn't tell anybody. This is like this is how the climax where, you know, the conflict happens. But Julia, remember I spoke to you about the multicultural family. Julia has been reading to him, and she made this little book for him about Nigeria and the life there and how things happen and the compound. And Chester starts to dream about that because Julia has read to him about it. The conclusion of this story. So every year, they say that Chester shows his independence. And he says, I don't want to be king of the Orient anymore. So what happens is, every year, there would be a nativity play. So a nativity play is the birth of Christ. It's that play. So what would happen is, every year, Jenny would make sure that Chester is cast in the role of one of the kings of the Orient. So Chester says to her, so where's the Orient man? And she says, like the East, like Africa where you come from, you know, your people. And Chester goes like, okay, so you're not my people, and you think that because I look like this, I must be that king. And then Chester refuses to play the king in the nativity play because he knows where the king of the Orient comes from. And he knows that Ginny wants him to play that role because he is black, because he looks like a king from the Orient, okay? But he still relies on Arthur, and he can show his love for Ginny. How do we know that he still relies on Arthur? Because he calls him, he says, my dad, Rock of Gibraltar, okay? And he still depends on Ginny to be his mum, but he is becoming his own person. And how does he start with that independence? By saying, I am not going to be king of the Orient anymore. Lovely. Characters. Chester, he's a round character. Now, before we move on to why, let's just discuss the relationship between him and his sister Julia. Okay, so he's got, Julia's his older sister, and when Chester goes to school, Julia's very protective of him. Okay, and their bond, brother and sister, no questions. Round, why is he a round character? Because he changes. He has to face up to being different, struggles with identity problems because he's a black child in a white family and a largely white community, and without knowing that he's been adopted, he knows that he's different because he looks different. There's no way he can deny it. He tries not to cause trouble, and he feels because he doesn't fit in, he needs to prove himself. You know, so he tries harder than other kids. His independence realized when he says, I'm not going to play the black king anymore because that is what makes you feel comfortable. Not doing it, I'm not comfortable, move along. Okay? Then, we have Ginny. Ginny's the mum. So, remember, childless. Now, she gets to adopt children. She's a devoted mother to her adopted children. There's no idea of them not being hers. Okay? She needs to accept, however, that they are becoming their own people. They are changing. They are growing. They are sort of discovering their own identities. Okay? And she needs to understand that they are asserting themselves and that they are growing up. But that she is still their mum and that they still lead her. Then we've got Julia. Okay? So Julia is Chester's sister. So we don't know too much about her. We just know that she's very protective of Chester. Like when he goes to school the first day, he cries, and then Julia is able to calm him. And we also know that when she finds out about her adoption, she becomes very withdrawn and distant because she had no idea. Okay, remember, they are at the beach when her dad tells them, Arthur tells them, and then she says, let's just go. Like, let's just go have tea, let's just continue. So then they just go on. But Julia, because look, remember her story. Chester's mum chose the Arlingtons. Chester's mum loved him enough to find him a good home. Julia's mother left her in a plastic bag at a bus station. She could have died. So now she's probably thinking, my mother didn't even love me enough to make sure I ended up in a good place. So with regard to their circumstances that they come from, Chester is better off because his mother sought a safe home, a warm, a loving, safe space for him. Julia's mother didn't do that. She just abandoned her. So they come from two completely different backgrounds. Chester's adoption was out of love. Julia's was as a result of abandonment. And she, when she discovers her adoption story, becomes distant and withdrawn. Arthur, dad, remains the same throughout the story. Observant, he sees everything. Dependable, when anything happens and they need help, Arthur's there and he's supportive. Eventually, Chester says, Rock of Gibraltar. Okay? And you know from your lessons in class what the Rock of Gibraltar is. The themes in the new tribe, racial integration. Why? Because the community in St. Simon, they have to adopt or adapt to having this black child, Chester, from Nigeria in the community. He's part of the church, he's part of the school, he's part of their family. He's there to stay. So he has to become part of that community, okay? And they have to accept him. So that integration of different races happens. It's actually very hard because Chester's the only black child. So it's kind of difficult racial integration with just the one child, but they need to do that. Mixed race families, the Arlingtons, because they've adopted this child from Nigeria and there's nobody else there that they can learn from. They can't go to the neighbors and say, listen, my son or my daughter, Nigeria and black and culture, and Jenny tries her best. And you know what's so sad about the mixed race family and the difficulty that Jenny faces is that when she tries to teach Chester about Nigeria and his roots, she actually makes him feel separate from her. Because I mention again, your people. Chester thought that they were his people, you know. So the question here with that is, how should Jenny have approached raising her mixed race child? So with adoption, and I'm actually going to go back and answer the question about the mixed race child in terms of identity. Adoption. So when Julia's left and they apply, she's left in the Tesco bag and they apply for adoption. It's a long process and Jenny is afraid. What if Julia's mother comes back? What if Chester's mum changes her mind? So there's that constant thing about the biological parent wanting to reclaim their child and the adoptive parent, they being at the receiving end of that. And then also, if the child does stay, what kind of issues are they going to have to face with that adopted child? Because remember, the child comes from a different family. It's not like when we do something wrong, our parents can say, oh, you're just like your father. Oh, I can just see your grandfather in you. They don't know where Julia comes from. They don't know where Chester comes from. But they've chosen to adopt them, which means that they've chosen them through good and bad. And they will have to navigate their way through that, okay? While facing the fear that these adopted children want to meet the biological parents, or vice versa, their biological parents might come and search for them. Right, identity problems. So Chester struggles with his identity. Why? Because Chester he's supposed to fit in, okay? He needs to fit in, right? But now, what does it mean to fit in? Does it mean that he needs to be the same color? Does it mean that he has to be the way that they are? Okay, so Julia doesn't make that, not Julia, Jenny doesn't make that easier. Because when she adopted Julia, she just went about mother-daughter, okay? And raised her probably like she would have raised her own daughter. But with Chester, because of the cultural and the racial dynamic, Julia doesn't know what to do. And in her struggle to teach Chester about himself, she raises the awareness within him of the fact that he doesn't know who he is. She could have just said, you are my son, I am your mother. I love you, we've chosen you, and that's how it is. And let Chester develop in that environment. But Jenny took it a step further and tried to tell him about his heritage. Remember, Chester was 4 when he said, who's my real mother? And at that point, Jenny had now already been trying to say, oh, Chester, Nigeria, this, that, the other. Instead of just being, I'm your mum, I'm here, Arthur and I love you, we are your parents, and waiting for Chester to develop at his own pace. And when he was ready, realized, oh, but you can't be my mother because you're white. And then asking her the question, instead of her creating the awareness before the time, by saying, oh, black, king of the Orient, and your people, you know, and that gives rise to Chester's identity problem. So the one lesson that we can take from here is that we are not, where we come from and where we are going is not cast in stone. We need a safe space in which to develop, okay? Julia needs a safe space to deal with the fact that her mother abandoned her, and we know that Arthur's dependable and strong. He's the Rock of Gibraltar. He will be there. That space is there. Okay? And she will probably learn to grow out of it. Chester, we know that he regards Arthur as the Rock of Gibraltar. And we know that because of the identity problems that he has faced, he's gotten to the point where he says, no, I am not doing that King of the Orient. So we get the sense that Chester is starting to make peace with who he is and where he comes from. So if we look at the story in its totality, we realize that it's actually it's a story of hope. as most of the stories that we've covered are we meet characters who stand out above the rest. We meet characters who are strong. We meet characters who are weak, who grow, who change, who develop. And the entire genre of our short stories this year, grade 12, is a message of hope. That in adverse times, if we look deep within ourselves, we are able to grow and change and find what we need. That concludes my presentation. That's me. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. I trust that you have found it useful. I've tried to put as little sort of distractions as possible and giving you as much information as possible. And I sincerely hope that it works well for you, and I wish you all the best with your exams. Thank you so much.